This Sandusky sex abuse scandal has the nation's attention, and it isn't as though this is something that is peculiar to this region of Penn State. It's happened so many times, whether it's the Boy Scouts or it's the Catholic Church and others. But it's something that clearly, now that it is out in the forefront, hopefully we do something to really make a difference in children's lives, protecting children, not only here, but all over the country. With us tonight for a little while is Nick Bryant. He's author of the book, The Franklin Scandal, a story of power brokers, child abuse, and betrayal. Nick, welcome to KDKA. Good to have you on tonight.
Robert.
Thank you very much for making time for us tonight, Nick. Do appreciate it. You wrote about what happened at Boys Town in Nebraska. Are you seeing similarities between what's happened at Penn State and what's being alleged at Penn State and what took place at Boys Town in Nebraska?
Thus far, I mean, more and more is emerging about Penn State. It started out as kind of a bang, and then there's been a succession of bangs since then. And it definitely points to a cover-up. I mean, there were certainly a number of people at Penn State, and there were people in law enforcement. Actually, there were people in social services that were aware of Sandusky, if not in 1998, certainly in 2002. Mm-hmm. And then you had Penn State, and this is what's kind of troubling. The administration of Penn State knew what Jerry Sandusky was about, and yet Penn State and a number of its affiliates poured money, thousands of dollars, into Second Mile Foundation. And in the book I wrote, The Franklin Scandal, it was similar because there was actually a pedophile network that flew kids from coast to coast and pandered them, and they were plundering Boys Town, which is a fabled orphanage outside of Nebraska, or outside of Omaha, Nebraska. And so there's some parallels there, and that was covered up. That wasn't really covered up by any, that was actually covered up by some law enforcement entities. And we have yet to determine whether law enforcement could have pressed this Sandusky case more, and if they are guilty of covering up. But in the Franklin scandal, I actually show that there was a large pedophile network that plundered Boys Town that was actually covered up by people in law enforcement.
One of the things that's just so disturbing about this entire scandal that is rocking Penn State right now is the seeming level of involvement of high-ranking officials at Second Mile that they knew. They had reason to believe. I mean, they knew of allegations going back at least to 98, quite possibly even before that, and didn't do what seems to be much, if anything, to limit access to Jerry Sandusky to these kids. In fact, he remained completely involved with the institution until he decided to step down in September of last year.
After he knew he was being investigated.
Yes. I mean, the grand jury convened in 2008. He told them he was being investigated, and my goodness, he remained a part of that organization until he decided he wanted to retire.
Well, I'm just thankful that the grand jury in Pennsylvania wasn't corrupt. It's very easy to corrupt a grand jury. You can pick a special prosecutor, and grand jurors are basically citizens that show up for jury duty that are directed to a grand jury. And the grand jury that I wrote about in the Franklin scandal, it was obviously hijacked to cover up child abuse. And I managed to acquire the sealed testimony of that grand jury, and actually I excerpted it in my book just to show how corrupt that grand jury was. And in Pennsylvania, I'm just really thankful that there was a grand jury that really did auger into Sandusky and did indict him on multiple counts of child abuse, because that wasn't the case in the pedophile network that I investigated in Nebraska.
Nick Bryant with us, author of the book, The Franklin Scandal, a story of power brokers, child abuse, and betrayal. Some people are expressing great concern that it took well over 2 years to bring about charges ultimately. that maybe the charges should have been brought much sooner. Maybe not an entire count of 40 counts, but was there enough earlier on to be able to bring about a couple of counts that were worthy of being charged, that you believe that you could get a conviction on, arrest the man, and then quite possibly protected others from being abused over the course of the past 18 months if you had enough information inside of 6 months? Your thoughts about that?
Well, that's one of the troubling things. I mean, with the Franklin scandal, and recently there was a case with Jeffrey Epstein, who has settled, I think, over 30 cases involving civil cases involving exploitation of minors, and yet he was only charged with one count of procuring minors, even though state authorities were cognizant of him having sexually exploiting other minors, and certainly the feds. When they came in to investigate, because there was such outrage in Palm Beach that he'd only been indicted on one count of procuring a minor, the feds came in and they had a list of approximately 40 victims, and yet they didn't prosecute. So these cover-ups, we've seen it in the Catholic Church, we've seen it in Nebraska, we've seen it in Boy Scouts, we saw it with Jeffrey Epstein. So these types of cover-ups, are quite common, unfortunately. I mean, Americans don't want to believe that heinous crimes against children are being covered up, but unfortunately, that is the case. Now, I'm not saying that it's the case all the time, but it's the case far too often.
One lawmaker, State Representative Tony DeLuca from the Pittsburgh region, he's a Democrat, Governor Corbett a Republican, but he isn't happy with the way Governor Corbett handled the investigation, especially back when Governor Corbett was Attorney General. He's calling on the feds to step in and take over the investigation here. Do you think that there's an advantage that could come from having the feds come in and then you completely remove any possibility of any attempt to cover anything up, any amount whatsoever?
Well, in my book, and also with Jeffrey Epstein, we saw a tremendous outrage in Nebraska, and we also saw a tremendous outrage in Palm Beach. And then the feds came in, and then they covered it up. So that's what I'd be really cautious about, is like a federal grand jury coming in. And because grand juries can be, as I said, they can be easily hijacked. If the special prosecutor doesn't want to find evidence, doesn't want to present evidence to grand jurors, he doesn't have to, or she doesn't have to.
Well, I tell you what, I got to take a break here. When I come back, I'm going to talk more about this seeming willingness to cover things up, why people are willing to turn a blind eye to sexual abuse of children, why it's so difficult for people to come to the realization that this is going on and that it needs to stop. And is it just because we're collectively just that evil? It's mind-boggling to me the way people rationalize allowing it to continue.
They're naive.
All right, Nick Bryant. We'll come back with more with Nick in a moment. Once again, Nick Bryant, author of the book, The Franklin Scandal, a story of power brokers, child abuse, and betrayal. Back with more in a moment.
There's only one station Pittsburgh depends on for breaking news, weather, and traffic. The voice of Pittsburgh. News Radio 1020 KDKA.
Ho, ho, ho.